Red Dead Redemption 2 is one of my favorite games of all time, and there are a lot of reasons that can be attributed to that. It's got a sweeping score, its missions are bold and cinematic, but something that I keep coming back to time and time again as the years go on is its characters. And I'm far from the first person to say this, but I strongly believe that Red Dead Redemption 2 has some of the best character writing out of any video game I've ever played. Most of all, I'd have to say being in its protagonist and main character, Arthur Morgan. Arthur, even more so than John in the original game, is a complex man. He's got a lot of admirable qualities, a lot of things that make him a really badass, rootin' tootin' cowboy sort of guy. But he's also a career criminal. And unlike John from the first game, who seemed to be doing all of the things he was doing more out of convenience and for the sake of saving his family, Arthur seems to get a little bit more from it. But I could sit here for 10,000 hours and talk to you about the intricacies of Arthur Morgan. He's a very, very dense, complex character, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about him. But in the interest of keeping things relatively brief and consistently interesting, I thought it might be better to highlight one specific thing that the narrative does towards the end of the game that I find significantly effective. Also, I know this game is a million years old, and the ending is one of the most famous parts of it, but here's an official spoiler warning for Red Dead Redemption 1 and 2. So, Arthur Morgan dies at the end of the game. Very similarly to how Red Dead Redemption 1 ended, with John Marston being assassinated by the very same government he spent the entire game running around assassinating people for. But Arthur's end is a little bit less dramatic in some areas, a little bit more in some others, and far more self-inflicted. So I want to take a moment to talk to you about the ending of Red Dead Redemption 2, and more specifically, what leads to that ending. Let's you and I go on a journey and talk about the final days of Arthur Morgan. Alright, I'm just going to jump right into it. I'm going to assume that if you're still watching at this point in the video, you have at least a baseline understanding of the character, of the gang, of their relationships with each other, and also because I really fucking hate in every video when people are like, let me jump back to the very beginning and tell you about when Arthur Morgan was born. I don't give a fuck. I don't think you do either. At the tail end of one mission, Arthur is sent to go collect a bounty from this family. The husband tells Arthur he doesn't have the money, he can't pay him back, but Arthur won't take no for an answer. He beats this man mercilessly. Arthur rides back to camp as a tense, ambient track begins to rise, almost signifying that although this seemingly innocuous event was seemingly innocuous, it is laden with deeper, harder significance. You see, this husband character coughs a couple times onto Arthur's face. You can actually see the blood coming out of his mouth. And I think it's pretty obvious where this is going. Cut forward to like 20 hours later in the game. It has been a lot of time. Arthur begins to show small signs that something is wrong. He starts coughing during cutscenes, then sometimes he'll do it during gameplay, and then, at a particular juncture, you're walking, usually through Valentine, but I've been told it can vary, and Arthur begins to cough, worse than he ever has before. He coughs, and he hacks, and he falls to the ground. So I want to pause right here and bring up that this is the first time technically that the game is drawing your direct attention to Arthur's malady. But I think that is beautiful and brilliant. And I, first time I was playing this game, having no idea what the ending was going to be, still managed to notice that Arthur was coughing. What's that going on? I thought to myself, there's no way that's fucking random. Turns out I was totally right. I just think it's really cool that they allow you as a player to pick up on these little hints they're leaving along the way and figure this out maybe a little bit for yourself. Even if you don't figure it's tuberculosis, you can put together something seems fucking wrong here. Arthur goes to the doctor after he passes out and he gets his diagnosis. The man washes his hands aggressively and seems sad just imagining the fate of Arthur. From this point forward, it is a race against the clock. Though the seriousness of his illness has yet to settle in on Arthur, you can sense a change in the man. Every mission he does, every person he helps, has a renewed sense of urgency, because there's a knowledge in his mind and in the player's mind that you are walking on borrowed time. This is genius, because it would suck as a player to have your gameplay impacted by this illness. And also, not to mention, tuberculosis historically was a pretty slow creep. It started with a couple nasty coughs here and there, and before you know it, you can barely breathe because your lungs are filled with fluid. So I think that's cool. They actually let you play through these missions and progress pretty normally, except for a cough here or there that sounds pretty gross. In fact, they almost let you forget. It takes a real backseat in the narrative as Dutch and what's going on with the gang and some other characters you've met along the way takes center stage. But Arthur can't run forever. His coughs get worse to the point where even the other gang members you're talking to in camp are like making comments about it. Again, driving home the feeling that you are running out of time. It eventually gets to the point where Arthur seems to realize within himself the seriousness of what's going on. My favorite moment comes when you see the nun about to get on the train. Arthur and her sit down and have a content conversation. He knows that the end is looming. He knows it isn't going to be pretty. And she assures him that he's been a good man, that he's helped people, that he has had a significance in his life. It's a beautiful, beautiful scene. The game continues after that. Arthur's coughs get worse. You realize somewhere along the line as a player, along with Arthur, that there's no getting out of this. If the time period wasn't enough to clue you in, there's no getting out of this. And you, along with Arthur, are caught in this sort of back and forth tumble between forgetting while you're focusing on these bigger, more explosive missions, remembering and sitting with it for a moment, and it eventually progressing to the point where it can't be ignored anymore. You keep playing. The gang starts to, and then eventually completely leaves. It gets down to John Marston, Dutch, Micah Bell, and Arthur Morgan. At this point in the game, Arthur is a shambling corpse. His coughs have become more frequent than his clean breaths, but at some point acceptance seems to hit him, and his mission becomes his one and only goal. Cut to the very end, Arthur is weak and hyperventilating on the dirt. Micah is pleading with Dutch to come on with him, and Dutch seems somehow to begin to put these pieces together, that Micah was the interloper the whole time, that Arthur was right, and that Arthur means what he says.
I gave you all I had. I did.
He did. Dutch and Micah storm off, and Arthur is left, laying on this mountainside as he watches the sunrise for one last time. That is, unless you're me. Because you see, guys, I had fucking negative karma. So what does that affect for most of the game, except dialogue changes? Basically nothing until you get to this last fucking section, where instead of talking to the nun and having this beautiful conversation, he talks to the fucking drunk pastor that's just walking around the camp the whole fucking game, and the pastor's basically like, "That's life, Arthur. Shouldn't have gotten tuberculosis, you dumb bitch." Am I the dumb bitch for playing this game? Oh, and then the ending is fucking changed. So instead of this beautiful, soulful moment, this complete arc, this completion of this arc they've been setting up since the beginning of the fucking game, Micah just screams and fucking shoots Arthur's brains out. What the fuck? What the fuck? Listen, this narrative is really, really well written, okay? And I'm not denying that, and this doesn't really take away from that, but I just wanted a moment to acknowledge that that was fucking stupid. But circling us back to the point here, this is one of the coolest things I've ever seen a video game do. Use the gameplay to strengthen the themes of its narrative. I think that's what's most impressive about this game. And I also think, like I said at the beginning of this, that this is but one facet, but one small iota of what makes this story and this game so powerful, so effective. But it's in these last days with Arthur that so much about the character is revealed. You get access to a certain vulnerability in Arthur that you hadn't really seen before, or at least not to the same extent. And it's also an opportunity to draw together other parts of the narrative. Arthur is clearly on the verge of dying, but Dutch doesn't seem like he gives a fuck, which is great. It makes a very beautiful point about where Dutch has progressed to, how many of his principles he's let go of, to the point where Arthur, his basically surrogate son, is coughing up his lungs in front of him. And he's still paranoid. He's still worried that Arthur is fucking up to something. And I don't even really have, like, a cohesive argument or point to pull all of this information together. I just think it's really impressive what Rockstar Games managed to achieve. You could make a movie with a similar sort of thing going on, you know, where a character has tuberculosis and is slowly dying. But the thing is, you are the main character. And yeah, it's Arthur Morgan, and he's a well-written character, and he's got so much depth that I would be very hard-pressed to imagine anyone saw him as a surrogate for themselves. But it doesn't even matter, because by the time he starts to go, you are Arthur Morgan. You're as fearful about this prospect as he is, as you see in these little moments. I think Red Dead Redemption 2 is a beautiful, beautiful game, and I think this is a beautiful way to begin and then finally conclude the send-off of one of Rockstar Games' best protagonists. Arthur Morgan is many things. A horseback rider, a career criminal, an old American gangster, but what you see as the game begins to wrap up is a softer, gentler side to him. And Arthur Morgan's final days, he was good. And although in my fucking save file, he's apparently a prick that the characters are talking shit about in the fucking epilogue, I'll remember him as good. Alright, big ending thesis here. Play Red Dead Redemption 2. It's a great game. I really love it. I think you will too.